Hey everyone, welcome back to episode 8 of Trailblazer 2 Traveler. This is the first of a 3-part special for the series, the Wildfire Special. In HSR, we have 3 units that are part of the Wildfire faction, and I wanted to design these 3 units to have a special team comp synergy. This episode covers Luca, who's going to be a Pyro on-field DPS. Part 2 will be Natasha, who's a Dendro support. Finally, Seele is part 3, and she'll have the role of an Electro off-field DPS. Before we begin, disclaimers, timestamps, social media links, music credits, and a link to my Discord server are all down below. Captions are available if you need them. Without further ado, let's start part 1 of the T2T Wildfire Special. I want this 3-part special to be my test run into lore-related faction mechanics. The idea is to incorporate shared mechanics that encourage similar team comps, but through natural synergies in the same types of teams, these units can be paired well if played together. Now, I feel like I have to drill this in because some of you are probably shitting yourselves at the mere mention of a faction mechanic. This mechanic is meant to be a fun little nod to their connections in the lore. It isn't supposed to be party restrictive like the Nodcry Moonsign stuff, especially since there's only 3 members in Wildfire. Yes, they have natural synergies that make them strong if played together, but you are not going to lose out on major effects if they are played alone. There is no bonus stating stuff like, when 2 or 3 Wildfire members are in the party, X effect happens. All incentives will come from natural kit synergies. It's basically my idea of pushing indirect incentives as opposed to a direct restriction. As for this Wildfire mechanic itself, Luca and Natasha will be the 2 who enable this. In burning teams, what they enable essentially allows single target abilities to gain AoE coverage. This mechanic is going to be a strong buff to all burning teams, as this effect can work on other characters. Since Luca is Pyro and Natasha is Dendro, they are the units who enable the effect for burning, but since Seele's Electro, she will not. Her kit instead's gonna be overload focused, but she'll be a character who can capitalize on the effects of Wildfire, and by proxy, is capable of functioning in these burning teams. Now, let's talk about this special Wildfire mark that Luca and Natasha enable, which is basically an A0 passive. Through their skills, they can apply this mark onto a single enemy. When opponents with a Wildfire mark are affected by burning, they will emit a Wildfire aura, which not only deals burning damage to the marked enemy, but also enemies within the area. Under certain conditions, when characters deal damage to enemies within the aura, that damage can spread to other enemies in the radius. Dendro and Pyro damage are locked behind a 0.5 second cooldown, but are otherwise unconditional. Other elements will only spread its damage if that hit triggers a Pyro reaction. Spreaded instances of elemental damage are capable of applying an element and triggering further reactions. The general gist is that this Wildfire mechanic allows you to turn certain burning comps into AoE-friendly teams. If Emily were to deal Dendro damage to an enemy, all enemies within that aura's radius take the same hits as if they were all being hit by her lantern. If you were to run Furina and vaporize one of her skill hits, all enemies within the radius will take that hydro damage instance. Since Wildfire applies a burning aura to all enemies, and since the spreaded damage can apply an element, the example with Furina is that she can vaporize on the other enemies. This makes variants of burn comps a lot more interesting. Wildfire auras can last for 2 seconds after a burning aura disappears on the marked enemy, and this provides some flexibility for the aura to still be present even in those variable teams where burning is not 100% active. Finally, Luca and Natasha have 2 distinctly labeled Wildfire marks, similarly to the Nodcry artifacts providing 2 different types of Gleaming Moon. Luca's will be Wildfire Singed and Natasha's is Wildfire Preserved. If both of these Wildfire marks are on the same enemy, the radius of the aura will be increased. Now, the radius of a Wildfire aura with only one of the marks is around 7 meters, which is the same radius as Shalonen's Red Shred. The radius of 2 marks on an enemy is probably going to be around 9 to 10. This is in place because Luca and Natasha are both going to have effects where you'd want to target the enemy that's marked. You do have the option to mark 2 enemies and effectively increase the range of Wildfire, But for ease of comfort, it is better to mark the same enemy to proc both of their individual effects. The increased radius is just a nice quality of life bonus in case enemies are more spread out, but aside from that, there's no other direct bonus to playing them together. And if played solo, 7 meters should be a decent radius for enabling this AoE effect. Alright, with all that out of the way, let's move on to Luca's general stats. His element's going to be Pyro due to its very red and fiery visuals. He also has to be someone who enables burning in the first place. His weapon is going to be a Catalyst, and he'll have the same visuals as Heizo and Wriothesley with their melee-oriented playstyles. His Ascension stat is going to be a 24% attack bonus. Between that and Pyro damage, he's going to already have a decent amount of damage percent sources, so attack percent helps balance it out a little bit. On to the basic attacks. It's all going to be the usual stuff in regards to damage and animations. There is one small mechanic tied to this ability. When normal attacks hit opponents, Luca gains a stack of Fighting Will, and this can occur once every 0.2 seconds up to a max of 4 stacks. Luca can build up stacks at any time, but he's only able to consume them while in his skill's Flying Spark state. What is Flying Sparks? When you use your skill, Luca enters this state, dealing an instance of AoE Pyro damage. He'll also mark a single enemy with Wildfire Singed for 15 seconds. As addressed in the A0 passive, the enemy affected by Singed will emit a Wildfire aura if affected by burning. You can tap or hold the skill. If held, Luca can target a specific enemy to mark. If Luca taps his skill and Natasha's Wildfire mark is already active on an enemy, Luca's mark will automatically link itself to that enemy. This allows you to have consistency in linking the same enemy with the two marks. While in the Flying Spark state, Luca's normal attack damage is increased, and this is a multiplicative bonus similar to Yoimiya, Wanderer, or Wriothesley. If Luca has 4 stacks of Fighting Will, he can unleash his special skill, Sky Shatter Fist. This will deal an instance of Pyro skill damage. If this hits an enemy while a Wildfire aura is active, he will trigger Rising Uppercut and deal an additional instance of Pyro damage, but this one is considered as burning damage. That's right, I'm already bringing direct reactions into my concepts. Basically, direct reactions are an instance of elemental damage that does not benefit from regular damage bonuses, does benefit from EM bonuses, and ignores enemy defense. What's also interesting is that direct reactions don't have to have the same multiplier value, and its base damage can scale off of any stat we want. In the case of Luca, this instance of burning damage could scale off of like 400% attack, but it also doesn't have that 0.25 multiplier that burning usually has. We can make burning whatever multiplier we want, but for the sake of simplicity, I'll just keep it at a one-time scaling. Flying Sparks will end if Luca leaves the field. Also, only one Wildfire Singed mark can exist at a time. The way Luca's skill functions is very similar to Freminet. When you enter his skill state, the stance allows you to consume Fighting Will stacks from his basic attacks and cast a special skill. If played in a burning team, Luca can spread all of his Pyro and burning damage to the rest of the party within that radius. As a final note to his ability, the intention with his design is that his normal attacks, skill, and direct burning damage all have a relatively balanced damage output, so you would want to build him in ways that balance out the damage stats. Here's a very important detail about his direct burning damage. While this original mechanic is inspired by lunar reactions, which are capable of critting, regular direct reactions would realistically not be able to. This will make Luca a unit who normally wouldn't build crit, but I wanted to ensure that he still maximizes the damage of his normal attacks and skill. So we have this A1 passive. If Luca's Rising Uppercut, aka the direct burning damage, hits the enemy affected by Wildfire Singed, that hit and subsequent spreaded instances will scale off his crit stats. Without this passive, you'd run into a slight split scaling issue. If you run an attack circlet, Luca's normal attacks and skill deal less damage due to less crit. If you run crit, Luca's direct burning damage is slightly less effective. This passive just ensures that all of Luca's damage can benefit from the same stat builds. It also creates an incentive to target the enemy marked with the Wildfire mark. Oh, speaking of stat builds, maybe we should address the Goblet too. Direct reactions across the board aren't able to benefit from elemental damage bonuses.
If you run Luca on pyro damage, his direct burning hits benefit less due to less attack stats. If you run attack, his regular pyro damage is nerfed. So, for his A4, 50% of Luca's pyro damage bonus is converted into a damage bonus for his burning hit. This means if you were to run a pyro damage goblet, which is a 46.6% bonus, his direct burning damage is increased by around 23%. Once again, it's there to provide build consistency. Finally, Luca's burst, which is kind of a whatever aspect to the rest of his kit. He will deal pyro damage to all enemies. If his burst hits an enemy marked with Wildfire Singed, or if he applies that mark within 5 seconds after casting his burst, he enables the Kinetic Overload effect for 12 seconds. During this duration, all enemies within a Wildfire aura take increased damage from abilities and reactions. This is a nice instance of damage, and it helps improve the entire team's damage output, but it's also nothing super necessary. In a lot of cases, you could get away with less ER and just burst every other rotation. His burst cost will be 70, and his cooldown is 18 seconds. Okay, so we covered a lot of details with Luca, a lot of buzzwords and original mechanics, but despite that, how you play him is the easiest part to understand. After setting up your team rotation, you have the flexibility to do a skill burst combo or a burst skill combo. Personally, I think burst first is a better move, since it allows you to maximize your skill stance's uptime. In this duration, you want to be targeting the marked character. While you can technically target anyone within the Wildfire aura, doing this allows Luca to possibly crit. I envision his attack string is gonna go N1, N2, and then his N3 does 2 attacks, which can grant 2 Fighting Will stacks. So his optimal combo will be N3E. Do this as many times as possible in his skill's duration, and that's all there is to his playstyle. For additional notes, I want to quickly cover constellations. I've been slowly straying away from specific constellation details, because it's kind of been the same old thing. So for this, I'm just going to give a list of possible constellation buffs that he could utilize, just without any specific labelings. First off, any sort of attack, damage, or crit buff works perfectly fine on him. Attack and crit in particular are universal across his abilities, and if you want to add damage percent, it might be better to go for pyro damage, so that even his burning hits can benefit. You can also consider energy bonuses. Even if he doesn't have to burst every rotation to be viable, giving him something to make that part more consistent is still nice to have. I think attack speed is also a very good buff. Since you're not really running Luca in Vape or Melt, you shouldn't have to worry about the possibility that he would apply too much pyro. Giving him attack speed means faster normal attack hits, which result in faster skill procs and burning hits. Finally, for his C3 and C5's talent level ups, his burst is not that important to his kit, so we would opt to upgrade the basics and skill talents. And that's all there is to Luca's kit. Let's talk about Luca's best builds now, starting with artifacts. Despite the addition of direct burning damage, Luca's overall builds will be the same as any other generic pyro DPS. You want an attack sand and a crit circlet. As for his goblet, we're still going to prioritize pyro damage. Even if direct burning is inspired by Lunar Reaction's direct damage, which don't use elemental damage goblets, his A4's pyro damage conversion allows him to keep a regular build. For substats, you should still focus on attack and crit. EM can technically work to buff his burning hit, but his attack multiplier scales better. Energy recharge is also a good side stat for bursting on rotation, though it's not as necessary. As for the sets, this is where things get a little more interesting and complicated. The most obvious choice you might think of is Unfinished Reverie. This gives attack and a 50% damage bonus when played in burning teams, which Luca naturally leans into. However, direct reactions such as his burning hit doesn't benefit from damage bonuses, so this 50% only applies to his normal and skill hits. You can run him on Lava Walker for a 35% damage bonus against pyro-affected enemies. This also provides a pyro resistance buff, which helps against the self-burning damage you'll take from being right up against the enemy. Both of these sets are still usable and very strong on him, but for my take on his best set, it's actually going to be Crimson Witch. This set can provide up to 37.5% pyro damage if you cast your skill thrice, which Luca is capable of doing. Unlike Unfinished Reverie's universal talent bonus, the pyro damage bonus can buff Luca's burning hit. This final point, however, isn't talked about as often. Most people use Crimson for the 37.5% pyro damage and the 15% vape and melt bonus. But there's also a 40% bonus to Overload, Burgeon, and Burning. This aspect of the passive is what inspired me to give Luca a special direct burning hit in the first place. He can use this flat 40% bonus for his burning hits, which is practically a main stat's worth for a damage goblet. In reality, if you combine a pyro damage goblet with Crimson's passives, Luca's direct burning hit has a baseline of an 82% bonus. Meanwhile, his regular pyro damage adds up to around 84%, so the bonus amount is roughly the same. This basically allows all of Luca's damage to have very similar bonuses, but you can run the same ADC build. I think trying out a mechanic like this gives Luca a few unique interactions with this very underutilized aspect of Crimson Witch. You can still run Reverie or Lava Walker if you just want to focus on Luca's regular damage, and you could also just run Vape Luca and disregard this section entirely. For other artifacts, self-burning damage from being too close to enemies results in HP loss, which leaves room for Vermilion Hereafter and Marochaussee Hunter. Vermilion provides 66% attack, which can buff all of Luca's damage. Marochaussee provides 36% crit rate, which is also universal in buffing. However, the two-piece effect does not buff his skill or burning hits. Final caveat is the prospect of shielders. In the event you run a shielder, you're protected against that burning damage, and this means you wouldn't proc the effects as easily. Moving on to his best weapons, Luca synergizes pretty well with anything providing attack, elemental damage, or crit. For free options, Flowing Purity is a craftable weapon that provides attack and elemental damage. It does require a good healer to clear the Bond of Life effects. There should be a decent amount of options, including my T variant of Natasha. Blackcliff Agate has a crit damage substat alongside attack bonuses when you defeat an enemy. Because the whole wildfire mechanic is meant to make AoE burning teams more viable, Luca is likely going to see more play in Horde or even multi-wave content. He'll be defeating enemies more often, so he'd be able to stack up the bonuses easier compared to boss content. For premium or gacha weapons, Widsith is there for a crit damage substat. Its passive can provide attack, EM, or elemental damage, though attack and damage percent would be the most preferable. Main downside is the super low uptime, so damage is going to be inconsistent each rotation. He can use the Solar Pearl very well as a Battle Pass option. Combos include a mix of basic and skills, allowing him to increase most of his damage across the board. The only thing unbuffed is his burning hits. Finally, he has a good list for 5-star options for stat sticks, though many of the passives are only partial buffs. Cash Flow and Tula Tula will buff his normal attacks, but it won't improve his skill or burning hits. Kagra's Verity is mainly a skill damage buffer, and his normal and burning hits only benefit from the 12% elemental damage bonus at max stacks. Memory of Dust provides a lot of attack when you bring a shielder, which is a teammate option you might consider in a good chunk of his teams. Lost Prayer can give him ramping up elemental damage, and it is specifically made for on-fielders. It's his best free-to-play 5-star option, and it works on all of his damage sources, though I personally never liked the passive. For his special signature, we are sticking with the Burning niche. The effect is not based on his original Light Cone, as I just went with a different effect entirely. Pearls of Sweat has a 565 base attack and an 18.4% crit rate bonus. For its passive, when nearby enemies take burning damage, the user gains a stack of Anticipator. Up to 6 stacks can be obtained, and each enemy can generate a stack every 2 seconds. Each stack grants the user a 4 to 8% elemental damage bonus for their element. Stacks last for 12 seconds and are counted independently. With this weapon, Luca's normal and skill damage gains a 48% damage bonus at R5, while his burning hits can deal an additional 24% through the conversion. You might have noticed that each enemy has a cooldown in which they generate stacks. This is because of Wildfire's purpose in burning teams. The Aura is not a damage buff. It's a buff that allows single target units to perform just as well in AoE. Luca is a single target character, but playing him in this scenario results in stacks taking longer to max out. It would take 10 seconds in single target, which is Luca's intended field time. In fights with 2 enemies, Luca would max out the stacks within 4 seconds. And in scenarios with 3+ enemies, you can max out in 2 seconds. Luca is capable of being a single target DPS, but once again, this weapon plays into his strengths as someone who performs a bit better in AoE content with at least 2 enemies. Our final section will cover Luca's team synergies. He's perfectly capable of functioning in other pyro comps such as Reverse Melt, Overload, or Mono Pyro. The only issue is that without a burning aura to enable Wildfire, he loses out on his special direct burning hit, which is a sizable portion of his damage. Overload and Mono Pyro take the biggest hits from this, but in Reverse Vaporize, it kinda balances out. Even without the direct burning hit, the instances of damage that do vape will be boosted, and can make up for his damage loss. Now, this is single target vape scenarios, because trying to do this in AoE content will be difficult. To reiterate, Luca is a single target unit, so without Wildfire, it'll take longer to fight hordes of enemies. If you were to run vape, your options are going to be fast hydro appliers like Xingqiu or Yelan. Furina should be capable of maintaining enough hydro in these teams as well. General melt comps could run double cryo to enable forward melts, or solo cryos for reverse melt. Then Overload can run a classic Chevreuse team. Once again, the only thing you really lose out on by not running a burning comp is the AoE aspect, and direct burning hits from Luca's skill. For burning teams, Luca is going to especially shine in scenarios with 2 or more enemies. If you enable Wildfire auras on him, he can trigger his special burning hits, and deal damage to every enemy in the vicinity. But his kit and Wildfire mechanics are not just meant to enable his AoE nature, it's a mechanic meant to support other units. In addition to regular synergies, we'll also look at niche scenarios of units who can utilize the Wildfire mechanic. This Luca video will cover off-fielders for the most part, while Natasha's video will cover on-fielders. But first, let's focus on which supports can buff Luca's personal damage the best. Luca's best teammate in this regard is going to be Bennett. As an attack scaling pyro character, Luca benefits immensely from Bennett's burst. At C6, he also grants a pyro damage bonus, which Luca is capable of using across his entire kit. There's also 25% attack from the pyro resonance. For other supports, Xiaolonen and Kazuha can both trigger their respective pyro reactions to provide a res shred and pyro damage bonus for Luca. Nahida is already AoE, but her A1 providing EM can boost Luca's direct burning hits, as well as serving as a Dendro applicator. Sucrose can follow a similar role with EM sharing, but her being Animo can also allow for VV Shred. Additionally, her C6 can provide a temporary pyro damage bonus, which Luca can utilize. For more niche synergies, Yunjin is the staple normal attack buffer. While Luca's primarily someone who likes all-around buffing, it is still possible to focus more attention on its autos if you so choose. The final niche synergy is Dahlia. As someone who doesn't have a lot of Hydra application, he would be a reliable character in not disrupting a burning aura. You could vape his skill and burst, then easily reinstate burning for the rest of his rotation. On top of that, some of his buffs might be useful to Luca. Shielding can provide interruption resistance and a small bit of damage mitigation. Then his attack speed bonus can allow Luca to deal more hits of damage, and maybe slot in extra skill and direct burning hits. This is a pretty copium pairing, but it's to be expected since Dahlia doesn't have too much in his utility. Alright, next up, we're gonna switch gears and look at Luca's synergies with units who can make use of the Wildfire mechanic. The listing is very similar to units who already function in burning comps, but because of the mechanic that single target abilities become AoE friendly, I want to shine more of a light on those particular characters. First off, Emily is one of Luca's best teammates, as these two have a more mutual dynamic. Emily can provide Dendro for the auras, a solid stream of damage, and a burning resistance bonus to help with Luca's survivability. Luca's Wildfire mechanic is able to turn all of Emily's damage into AoE hits. Her burst and A1 have decent AoE already, so they might not benefit as much if enemies are grouped together, but her skill hits are basically single target turret shots. As long as the shots are hitting an enemy in the radius, the damage can transfer to others. Next up is Furina. Similar to Emily, some of Furina's hits are more single target in nature, and the spreaded damage from Wildfire can improve on AoE content. More so, a burning team causes Pyro to have a more prevalent aura, so Furina is actually able to forward vape her hits and improve her personal damage. Furina is capable of buffing Luca's normal and skill damage, but this damage bonus from her burst is not going to buff the burning hit, as that is considered reaction damage. Cryo characters can function as strong DPSs in burn melt teams. A unit like Rosaria already has strong AoE coverage with her burst. So while Luca can synergize with her on a base level, someone like Kaya, who has smaller AoE, will see a much more noticeable difference in comparison. It also helps that Kaya's burst can follow Luca around, which prevents some circle impact issues. Escoffier is also a pretty solid choice. Even though she's meant to be a support for pure freeze comps, her personal damage is still pretty strong when she reverse melts. These hits are also single target, so she'll see a bigger difference in performance as well. Electro characters like Fischl or Yai can also see interesting dynamics in quick burn or overburn comps. With the right amount of application, you can see a mix of burning, overload, and quicken in these teams. But with lower electro application, you'll just have Fischl or Yai being overload triggers on a burning aura. The only main issue is that AoE content tends to focus more on squishier characters who are easily tossed around by overload explosions. So while it's possible to chain these attacks, it's also very likely that you'll see enemies getting knocked out of Wildfire auras, which reduce the potency of the AoE mechanic in the first place. You can play a niche comp with some Geo units like Albedo, Chiori, or Zhongli. If their Geo attacks crystallize, it can proc additional Geo damage to other enemies. Doing this can also proc further crystallize reactions, creating an effect where more shards can be dropped. If you don't run a shielder, the excess of shards on the field can help Luca stay alive a bit easier. Albedo in particular already has decent AoE on his skill, but the A4 passive's EM bonus essentially provides a larger damage buff to Luca's burning hits. Anemo characters in general can also work by triggering swirls, which can cause further Anemo hits that also swirl, but because they're already AoE in nature, you might not have these additional hits proc as much. Finally, Pyro characters. Most of the damage-focused ones are on-fielders, so I'll cover them in Natasha's video. There is one in particular that has a really weird interaction, and that's Xiangling. Her Pyronado has a 0.6 second cooldown on hitting each enemy, and this ICD prevents enemies from being hit multiple times in a short duration. But with good enough timing and positioning, you could still cause multiple instances of the Pyronado's spreaded damage in a single rotation, which can boost Xiangling's damage output. This can be a nice damage buff to her, since burning auras prevent her from reverse vaping. With that being said, Xiangling is already strong in AoE, so this Wildfire mechanic might not be too big of a buff. Overall, Luca is a unit who not only shines best in burning comps, but also someone who shines when paired with off-field damage dealers. His niche in burning helps him feel different from other pyro carries, who specialize more in vape or melt comps. While he likes personal supports like Bennett or Shilonen, off-fielders with single target damage see a nice buff with this new Wildfire mechanic. With that being said, his biggest downside is the fact that he's a 4-star on-fielder. Even if he has his burning niche, the competition for an on-fielder is still pretty tight. Natasha's video will cover more synergies with other on-field units, and with that video, you'll start to see that even though Luca has a strong synergy with Natasha, he's also pretty replaceable. But since burning is a reaction that doesn't require much finessing, he'll still be a comfortable option as a DPS, since you don't have to worry about auras for vape or melt. Anyway, that's gonna do it for part 1 of the T2T Wildfire special. I'm currently writing and recording this episode before Luna 2 drops, so I have no clue if I'll be able to code this in the Miliastra sandbox. Fingers crossed though, because I would like to add this in the game. I'll be covering Natasha and Seele in future episodes, so you can stay tuned for that. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. Let me know in the comments what you like about this Luca kit, what you would change, and any alternative ideas you might have. Consider joining my Discord server if you want to share more detailed ideas with the rest of our community. Thank you for watching everyone, and I will see you all next time. Bye!